This is a homily for the Solemnity of Pentecost. The first reading is from the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 2, verses 1 to 11. The second reading is from the letter of St. Paul to the Romans, chapter 8, verses 8 to 17. The Gospel for this Sunday comes from the Gospel of St. John, chapter 14, verses 15 and 16, and verses 23 to 26. To download the text of this homily as a PDF file, go to sundayhomilies.au. Over the past few weeks we have celebrated the death, resurrection and ascension of the Lord. Today, on the Feast of Pentecost, we celebrate the descent of the Holy Spirit upon the Apostles. Today's Feast of Pentecost brings the Easter season to a conclusion. Although we then return to what the Church's liturgical calendar calls ordinary time, we will be celebrating some important feast days over the next 3 Sundays. Next Sunday we celebrate the Feast of the Most Holy Trinity. The following Sunday is the Feast of the Body and Blood of Christ. And on the Sunday after that, we celebrate the Feast of the Apostles, Saints Peter and Paul. So today, on the Feast of Pentecost, let's begin by asking what Pentecost is all about. First of all, we need to keep in mind that Pentecost was, and still is, a Jewish feast. So why are we, as a Christian community, celebrating the Jewish feast of Pentecost? Our English word Pentecost comes to us from the Greek word Pentekoste, which means 50th. But what does the word 50th refer to? The 50th what? It refers to the 50th day. But what does that mean? At the time of Jesus, the feast was known as Pentecost by Greek-speaking Jews, but it was also known by its Hebrew name Shavuot, a word that means weeks. Weeks, in this case, means 7 weeks. So what does it mean to call a feast the 50th, Pentecost, or the Feast of Weeks, Shavuot? To answer that question, let's look at the Jewish calendar. It is a lunar calendar of 12 months and 4 seasons: spring, summer, autumn and winter. We're interested in the 3 months of spring: Nisan, Iyar and Sivan. During these months, the spring cereal crops of barley and wheat were harvested. These were the most important spring crops for the ancient Israelites, but barley matured much faster than wheat and was therefore harvested much earlier than the wheat crop. The harvesting of the barley crop is celebrated over 7 days during the month of Nisan. The barley harvest was known as Hag Hamazot, or the Feast of Unleavened Bread. As we'll see in a moment, the Feast of Passover was celebrated at the same time of the year as the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and over time the 2 festivals merged into a single celebration. The wheat crop is harvested 7 weeks later, sometime during the month of Sivan. So there is an interval of 7 weeks between the barley harvest and the wheat harvest. The Hebrew word for weeks is Shavuot, and that became the name for the wheat harvest festival. The festival of Shavuot, or weeks, has no fixed date in the Torah, but it was to be observed 7 weeks after the offering of the first ripe sheaf of barley, which means 7 weeks after unleavened bread or Passover. We need to remember that many Jews, especially those living in the diaspora, no longer spoke Hebrew. They spoke Greek, and so they called the feast of Shavuot the Feast of Pentecost. 7 weeks equals 49 days. And Pentecost, as we've seen, is the Greek word for 50th. It refers to the 50th day after unleavened bread or Passover. So, the wheat harvest was called Shavuot in Hebrew or Pentecost in Greek. Both names, Pentecost and Shavuot, indicate a period of time. The Greek word Pentecost measures the time in days, while the Hebrew word Shavuot measures the same period of time in weeks. As we've seen, the barley harvest was known as Hag Hamazot, or the Feast of Unleavened Bread. As I've already mentioned, the Feast of Passover was celebrated at the same time of the year as the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Passover was originally a rite practiced by shepherds. It involved the springtime sacrifice of a young animal in order to secure a fertile and prosperous flock, and the successful movement of the flock to summer pasture. The blood of the slaughtered animal was originally sprinkled on tent posts to drive away evil powers. At the time of the Exodus, this ancient ritual took on a completely different meaning. During the night of Passover, God struck the firstborn of Egypt and spared the houses marked with the blood of the Passover victim. In the history of Israel, these two feasts, Passover and unleavened bread, merged to become a single celebration, celebrating the Israelites' flight from slavery in Egypt. In the course of time, the feast of Shavuot or Pentecost also became associated with the Exodus story and commemorated Moses receiving the law on Mount Sinai. This reflected an ancient tradition that during the Exodus the people arrived at Mount Sinai 50 days after escaping from slavery in Egypt. Shavuot eventually became not only a celebration of the covenant, but an annual renewal of the covenant. This is the aspect of Shavuot that is celebrated by modern Jews, God giving his people the Torah on Mount Sinai. So Passover celebrates the end of slavery in Egypt. Shavuot or Pentecost celebrates the reception of the Torah on Mount Sinai. At the time of Jesus, Pentecost or Shavuot was one of the 3 great pilgrimage feasts in the Jewish calendar. The other 2 were Passover and Tabernacles. They were called pilgrimage feasts because the Torah laid down in the books of Exodus and Deuteronomy that all men had to make a pilgrimage to the temple in Jerusalem for those 3 feasts. 3 times a year you will hold a festival in my honour. 3 times a year all your menfolk will appear before the Lord God. The Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria, a contemporary of Jesus, referred to countless multitudes attending the pilgrimage festivals. The Jewish historian Josephus writes that at one Passover, in the year 65 AD, there was not less than 3 million visitors. Modern authors are a little more circumspect with their estimates. The German biblical scholar Joachim Jeremias estimated that about 200,000 pilgrims attended the pilgrimage festivals. E.P. Sanders estimated attendance at the pilgrimage festivals to be somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000, especially for the Feast of Passover. At the time of Jesus, about 1 million Jews lived in Palestine, but between 4 to 6 million Jews lived outside Palestine. Today's first reading from the Acts of the Apostles gives us an idea of how far people had travelled to be in Jerusalem for the festival of Pentecost. There were Parthians, Medes and Elamites, people from Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and the parts of Libya around Cyrene, residents of Rome, Jews and proselytes alike, Cretans and Arabs. Let's now return to the question, why are we as Christians celebrating the Jewish festival of Pentecost? The simple answer is that we are not celebrating the Jewish feast of Pentecost, but rather we're celebrating what happened on the first Pentecost following the death and resurrection of the Lord. Today's first reading tells the story. When Pentecost Day had come, they were all together, when suddenly there came from heaven a sound as of a rushing wind, filling the entire house in which they were sitting. And there appeared to them tongues as of fire. These separated and came to rest on the head of each of them. They were all filled with the Holy Spirit. Today's readings from the Acts of the Apostles, St. Paul's letter to the Romans, and the Gospel of St. John each offer us an insight into the presence of the Holy Spirit in our world. In the Acts of the Apostles, the descent of the Holy Spirit heralds the beginning of God's recreation. In the letter to the Romans, the Spirit makes us cry out, Abba, Father. And in the Gospel of St. John, Jesus tells us that the Father will send us the Advocate, the Holy Spirit. Let's begin with the theme of recreation. What does recreation mean? Well, the first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis, begins with the story of God's creation of the world. In the beginning, God creates heaven and earth. Then God creates the first human being from the dust of the earth, and then breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. God then planted a garden where the man would live. God creates animals, and finally a woman to become the man's companion. The man and the woman are free to eat the fruit of any tree in the garden, with one exception. They must not eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But that's exactly what they do, and so they are then banished from the garden. And as a result, even the ground is cursed because of their rebellion against God. The beauty of the garden is no longer theirs. The ground will now bring forth thorns and thistles, and they shall eat the plants of the field only after long and hard work. This is the story of God's creation and human waywardness. The New Testament tells the story of God's recreation of a rebellious and alienated world. So let's see how Luke is telling the story of recreation in today's first reading from the Acts of the Apostles. We'll do that by going back to chapter 1 of the book of Genesis. In chapter 1, verse 2 of the book of Genesis, we read that the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, and Ruach Elohim hovered over the face of the waters. The earth was a formless void. The Hebrew is tohu wabuhu, literally formless and void. Notice that I've left two Hebrew words untranslated. Those two words are ruach and Elohim. Elohim is the word for God, and ruach can be translated into English as wind or breath or spirit. The Greek equivalent is pneuma, and pneuma can also be translated into English as wind or breath or spirit. The ambiguity of the word in both languages explains the various translations of this verse that we have in contemporary Bibles. The Jerusalem Bible, published in 1966, translated Ruach Elohim as "and God's Spirit hovered over the water." However, the New Jerusalem Bible, published almost 20 years later in 1985, has "with a divine wind sweeping over the waters." However, the Revised New Jerusalem Bible, published in 2019, reverted to Spirit. It reads, "with the Spirit of God sweeping over the waters." The Revised Standard Version, published in 1952, has "and the Spirit of God was moving over the face of the waters." But the New Revised Standard Version, published in 1989, has "while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters." Let's look at how two contemporary Jewish translations render Genesis chapter 1 verse 2. Firstly, the Jewish Study Bible has "and a wind from God sweeping over the water." Secondly, Robert Alter's translation, published in 2019, "and God's breath hovering over the waters." So the Hebrew word ruach has been rendered in these translations as wind or breath or spirit. Let's see how Luke describes what took place on Pentecost Day. Luke tells us that there was a sound like that of a rushing wind. Tongues of fire came to rest on each of the disciples, and they were all filled with the Holy Spirit. So we have sound accompanied by fire, reminiscent of what we read in Psalm 29 verse 7. "The voice of the Lord kindles flames of fire." Notice that they were all filled with the Holy Spirit. Luke uses the Greek word pneuma, which, as we've seen, can be translated as wind, breath, or spirit. In the book of Genesis, creation begins with the Spirit of God hovering over the face of the waters, over the formless void. On Pentecost Day, often referred to as the birth of the church, God's Spirit fills the disciples. We have the beginning of the new creation. And let's see the fruits of this new creation. With the coming of the Spirit, the disciples are transformed. The Spirit of Jesus has stirred them to life, and they go forth to proclaim the good news. But strangely, while they spoke in their own language, which would have been Aramaic, visitors from all around the Mediterranean were able to understand, in their own language, what the apostles were saying. What is Luke telling us here? Here we have another variation on the theme of recreation. Let's go back to the book of Genesis. In chapter 11 we have the story of the Tower of Babel. What is that story about? We have a clue in the fact that our English word Babel, that is unintelligible gibberish, comes from the Hebrew verb Babel, which means to confuse or to confound. So in the book of Genesis we read the story of how the great diversity in human languages occurred. The story is set in Babylon at a time when, we're told, the whole world spoke the same language. Babel is in fact the ancient name of Babylon, and it means gate of the god. The people decide to build themselves a city and a tower with its top, we're told, reaching heaven. Now God is not pleased with this. The story suggests that there is something willful in this great endeavour, something full of pride, of hubris, of human self-aggrandizement, arrogant self-reliance, a sense of rebellion against God, of humankind not willing to accept subordination to their Creator. Humans are worshipping the work of their own hands, and that is idolatry. In the prophet Isaiah chapter 14, verses 13 to 14, the king of Babylon boasts, "I shall scale the heavens. Higher than the stars of God I shall set my throne. I shall climb high above the clouds. I shall rival the Most High." We're told that God comes down to see the city and the tower that the people had built. "So," God says, "they are all a single people with a single language. This is only the start of their undertakings." To thwart the people, God confuses their language so that they can no longer understand each other. This great building project comes to an abrupt halt, and the people are scattered all over the world. Now, does the author of the book of Genesis intend us to read this story as an eyewitness account of an event that explains the great diversity of human languages? Of course not. This, rather, is a theological reflection on a fundamental truth. If we are alienated from God, we will be alienated from one another. So with the new creation inaugurated at Pentecost, the curse of Babel is reversed. Through the power of the Spirit of God, the fragmentation of peoples that occurred at Babel is reversed, and the human race is being reunited. Let's now turn to St. Paul's letter to the Romans. St. Paul tells us that God's Spirit within us makes us cry out, "Abba, Father." It's important to note that Paul is writing in Greek, and so he gives us the Greek word for father, pater, but alongside the Greek word he also gives the Aramaic word Abba. We know from Mark's Gospel, chapter 14, verse 36, that Jesus addressed God as Abba. Such a mode of address for God, Abba, is unattested in the Old Testament. The Greek word pater and the Aramaic Abba are not exact semantic equivalents. The feel of Abba is something like "my own dear father." It is a term of endearment, suggesting a greater intimacy than the Greek word pater. Abba was a word used both by young children and even adult children in addressing their father. So it's not correct to translate Abba as daddy. In the words of New Testament scholar Tom Wright, it was entirely appropriate that God was known in an intimate familial relationship through this term Abba, a term tender and personal, used by adults as well as children. Let's now turn to today's Gospel, because Jesus uses an unusual word when he describes the Spirit. It is a word that we find only in the Johannine literature. The word in Greek is Parakletos. I spoke about Parakletos on the 6th Sunday of Easter. Parakletos is made up of para, which means close beside, stressing the closeness, and the Greek verb kaleo, which means to call. So the noun parakletos means literally one called alongside. The verb parakalein means to call alongside or to summon. So the parakletos is the one called alongside us, sometimes as advocate, attorney, or counsellor, and sometimes as comforter and consoler. If we really want to understand what a word means in a particular culture, we need to see how it was used at the time. We have an interesting example from the writings of the Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria. As you can see, Philo lived from 20 BC until 50 AD. One of his works is entitled In Flacum. In Flacum is about Aulus Avilius Flaccus, who was appointed prefect of Alexandria and Egypt in or about 32 AD. Flaccus was appointed during the reign of the Roman Emperor Tiberius, and Philo tells us that he showed considerable ability and industry during his first 5 years of office. He was also well regarded by the emperor. However, when Caligula became emperor in 37 AD, things went badly for Flaccus. He'd done a number of things that had alienated him from Caligula, whose formal name was Gaius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. Philo writes that Flaccus received the following advice: "Your expectations from the emperor are anything but favourable. We must find you a really powerful intercessor to propitiate Gaius." Gaius is, of course, the Emperor Caligula. The word that Philo used, translated here as intercessor, is parakletos. However, no such intercessor was forthcoming on this occasion, and the fate of Flaccus was sealed. He was arrested and taken to Rome for trial. Philo tells us, "Such was the unprecedented blow which fell upon Flaccus, carried off like a prisoner in war in the country in which he was governing. Then there came to him a rich harvest of misfortunes. He was at once deprived of all his property, both what he inherited from his parents and what he acquired for himself. And when his property had been taken from him, he was sentenced to banishment and expelled not only from the whole continent, which is the larger and better section of the habitable world, but also from every one of the islands in which life can prosper. For he was to be exiled to the most miserable of the Aegean islands called Giaros." When you look at this photograph of Giaros from the air, you can see why Philo called it the most miserable of the Aegean islands. It appears barren, arid, and lifeless. Not a blade of grass, not a tree in sight. A barren, rocky outcrop. However, Philo then tells us that Flaccus had found an intercessor, a person by the name of Lepidus. Lepidus interceded on behalf of Flaccus, and although he was not able to have the sentence of banishment overturned, Lepidus was able to have the place of banishment changed from Giaros to the nearby island of Andros. So Flaccus is banished to Andros, and as you can see from these photographs, Andros appears to be far more hospitable than the barren island of Giaros. Philo describes Lepidus as a parakletos. In other words, Lepidus stood alongside Flaccus and interceded on his behalf when Flaccus was absolutely destitute and powerless. That gives you a sense of how the word parakletos was used at roughly the same time that John was writing his Gospel. That calls to mind Earl Stanley Gardner's fictional lawyer, Perry Mason. Mason says of himself, "I'm a specialist on getting people out of trouble. They come to me when they're in all sort of trouble, and I work them out." John's Gospel assures us that the Holy Spirit is the Paraclete, the one who stands alongside of us to help us when we ourselves are helpless. The same Spirit leads us into an intimacy with the Father, making us cry out, "Abba, Father." And at Pentecost, the culminating feast of the Easter season, the Spirit of God renews the face of the earth, unleashing a new and unimaginable future for God's people.